podcast, we'll talk about one of those pesky terms beginning with post, slash, like postmodernity and such. This time around, it will be the term post-truth. Now, we won't talk about primarily its political usage because it came to prominence in popular everyday politics a few years ago. I would try to take it on its own right, in its own right, that is to say, try to depict the implications that it contains, not regarding daily political events that seem to characterize its usage in everyday life. That is to say, in everyday life of media. Now, the post-truth implies that truth is no more, in some way. That it is true to say the truth is no more. Now, as paradoxical as this may seem, it's not that paradoxical, I would claim, and I'll try to explain why. Now, to understand something that is negative, one has to start from the positive. So, notwithstanding that post-truth is based upon idea that there is no truth, there was implied some kind of truth that is somehow not with us anymore. That was an illusion. Because post-truth implies that there was a time when there was truth, and now that time has passed. This is very typical for modern and postmodern ideas, that absolute historicity of the things that people naturally for ages considered to be eternal. So let's see what is that truth that is not here anymore. I would say that this is the truth that is based upon judgment of true and false. Now, I use judgment judicially here. I don't use term inference, but judgment, because there is a very characteristic judicial aspect to this notion of truth. The best example of it would be the scientific truth, and especially the truth as expressed in science of history. So today, a good historian would be a man who will give you an account of what happened, for instance, in some really long bygone epoch, like ancient Greece or before, and give you an inference what is likely to have happened. Because, as we all know, the deeper in history you go, the less sources you have about it, usually. And those sources are sometimes not considered to be accurate, although anybody who worked in archaeology knows that ancient sources seems to be the best sources about some some historical events or whereabouts of some ancient history and medieval locations. But anyway, the truth that history professor, for instance, provides you with is the most likely, the most convincing explanation of something. And this explanation, especially in this science, is given from the standpoint of his own day and age, and necessarily so. So everything came to pass in some way to give us opportunity to explain it in our own terms. And there is no other way to look at things than like that, because in modernity, the sole benchmark of truth is human, that is to say, intellect, or what is understood as human intellect, in a very restricted way. That is to say, encompassing human cognitive power that only has to do with empirical reality, that is to say, reality that is mediated by senses, in which it, out of which it derives its concepts. Now, this may seem maybe restrictive, maybe it is, but for the sake of brevity, we'll have to stick with it. Although I think it really pinpoints what the modern notion of truth is about. Now, there is one thing about truth that is, excuse me, usually forgotten, and this is that the truth has to be the whole truth. Namely, all things are true, all particular things or instances of true are true only insofar as they somehow participate in truth, they are based in truth. Now, in modern times, this was not that obvious, because you had this great dispersion of sciences into various disciplines. But even in 20th century, some kind of process of synthesis was afoot, and this synthesis was and is to this very day been accomplished by creation of systems. The system is the whole truth. That is to say, the system is that one principle that gives meaning to disparate truths. Now, when I say truths in plural, there is nothing very controversial about it. You have science of life that is now today called biology. You have a science of movement that is now called mechanics or physics, even to some extent. And they are disparate. They cannot communicate. Their methods, their way of looking at things and the subjects is so disparate that whereas scientists are talking about one world, they are giving accounts that cannot be comprehended in terms of one world. What science came with was system. And for instance, I'll paraphrase J. Forrester, one of the early system engineers in American Army in cybernetician, that was later responsible for the computer modeling program that was ran for the sakes of Club of Rome predictions that turned to be abysmally false, but never mind. And Forrester himself said that system is this subjective form, invented principle that brings all this together. And as such, it is necessary. And a lot of people don't see this necessity of unifying moment, because you cannot have many truths. You have to have one truth. But the modern notion of truth is such that you have to rely on a very flimsy principle. And this systemic principle is in fact this form of the world that brings everything together, is human form. System is an abstract projection of man as taken in itself. Because this notion of truth relies upon human subjectivity of man as a measure, a man as one who passes the judgment. So, for instance, in terms of history, an example that we just began with, no matter how good this explanation is, it is very arguable. Does it tell the truth about some historical event? Because there are aspects of that event that cannot be understood, probably, by the modern man. And not only that, but there cannot be finite and absolute. So there are other historical interpretations, and this is very notable in history. And now those interpretations are called narratives. Now this is where we come to post-truth. Post-truth age relies on assumption that this kind of truth I just outlined is at the end. I would posit that this is very likely so. Not to say very likely true. We'll see what that implies just a moment later. So the post-truth age would be the postmodern age. That would be the age after the truth as is being understood in modernity. And in that age, only narratives, quote unquote, work. I have to confess that this is about the most repulsive word from English dictionary I ever learned. I hate it, but I have to use it now because it is widely used wherever you turn. Narratives are expressions, that is to say, codified systems of power that combat for dominance. And this is all we have to do, all we are dealing with now in public sphere, in media, and I would even say in academia and in politics. Today in the West, further you go west towards USA, England, you have these movements to bring down statues, to erase history, to denounce biological race as the ultimate benchmark of humanity, where white race is completely derided. You have all kinds of very destructive drives that are supported by institutions, which is very dangerous. And you have people who are countering them. And from what I see, people are countering them with an attempt at debate. Moving on assumption that they will win debates because they have quote-unquote reason, facts and logic on their side. Well, the trouble is, facts and logic, as they understand them, as empirical facts and logic that deals only with such facts without recourse to anything deeper in its foundation, as was the case before modernity, will not work. And it is obvious that they don't work. They are failing abysmally. The reason why they are failing, why their opponent is not because their opponents are not listening to them, because their opponents are supposedly ideologically possessed. It's because their opponents are adequate to an age in which they live. The people who are countering them with this modern rationality are clinging to something that I'm afraid is passé, that is on its way out, because its own principle made it such. The finitude of its principle made it finite. So it is true that there is no more truth. Now, what did I just say? This was contradiction, wasn't it? Yes. And this contradiction brings us back, just like kicks us back in the orbit of truth. But now we have to think what truth really is. The modern age and the notion of truth we just described obviously doesn't fit the bill. It doesn't fit the bill because it cannot be acted upon, it cannot be relied upon, and in fact it dissolved into infinity. There is no, in the principle or in the systemic principle that modernity invented, an invention of it is very important to note, this is invention of the fundamental of truth in some way. This principle is crumbling constantly. It cannot hold. The form of human being as a measure of all things cannot hold. This as a center, to paraphrase Yeats, cannot hold. This center doesn't hold. But interestingly enough, the very recognition of this fact, the very insight into this kicks us back, reflects us back as a mirror reflects light into something else. And we claim the true judgment. It is true that there is no more truth, and we refute the very idea that there is a post-truth age, because the lie, the idea that there is no truth, refutes itself. This is not a logical game, mind you. I'm aware that somebody who is not accustomed to philosophical discussions can see it like this, but it is not, in fact, because contradiction in existential sense is annihilation. And the annihilation is, dare I say, a very serious thing, and it's happening on a daily basis now, especially in the West. Not so much where I'm sitting, but that's not very comforting, because it is imbibing the whole Western hemisphere, I believe, or Western influenced countries and polities. So what is this notion of truth that we cannot escape, luckily? Well, it is the transcendental truth as a transcendental. I already talked and wrote about it. I put some links below so you can consult them, where I go in depth about what I mean by this. It is, in fact, a traditional notion of truth, which I always bring out in its Christian mode, that, in my opinion, developed it to perfection, all implications of it, in the teaching of the truth as transcendental, that is based in teaching that is based in fathers of the church, and that had its very subtle acquired very subtle form in Middle Ages, in High Middle Ages. And by that notion of truth, the truth is this congeniality of your intellect, of mind, and reality that is brought by the form that is not really anthropocentric, but is theocentric. It is theocentric in a way that encompasses human being also, and that can be in a way understood by human beings. This theocentric form is what is in Christianity called the Word of God. Because why is the Word the form, let's say, of the world, a form in which you can know the truth, the light in which you can know the truth? Because it is the expression of what is in God. It is, as a word in us, is the expression, word in a widest possible sense of the word. A word as expression of insight, of what is most articulated in us when you say yourself, when you express yourself, which is impossible to man, to an utmost, when you bring forth everything that is inner, intimate. This is the word, and this is the intimacy of God, the inner being of God being said. This understanding of truth, I would boldly claim, cannot be refuted so easily, if at all. And what may be counterintuitive for someone is that it's so unapologetically Christian, in my perspective. Well, the reason is that it in fact is such. There were ideas, there were understandings of the, let's say, notions of perfect man in pre-Christian antiquity, in pagan antiquity, Neoplatonism, for instance, there were, I wouldn't say notions, but fragments of notions. But in Christianity, you have it in such a way that centuries passed in the first 1,000 years of Christianity in defining precisely what it is and its relation to human. It's very subtle and with great effort. It's finally acquired understandable, that is to say, comprehensible form. So this is the form that unites everything. This is this one truth that you are always thrown back to. And it won't crumble, but you cannot know it in the sense you can know systemic truth. The reason is because systemic truth provides you with an illusion that you can know everything, in fact, because it is your, not individual, but human, your nature. It comes from your nature, it comes from imagination, in fact, from the autonomous ability of humans to create imaginary systems. It may seem counterintuitive that I am taking the ultimate objective principle of science to be product of imagination, but it is strictly a logical conclusion. It is a product of imagination because it is a product of methodical imagination, but imagination nonetheless. It is not something that is taken from empirical reality. You can't point a finger and say, here is system, there is system. Any particular being is not a system. System is what is all of them and none of them. What is frightening and interesting, it seems to be that this is kind of like inversion of this transcendental notion of truth, where truth, in fact, definition of truth is adequation of intellect to think, or conversely, as in all transcendentals, it is convertible, adequation of think to intellect. And it has a twofold meaning. It has a meaning of adequation in intellect of individual man who is knowing things and individual things, but ultimately it is the adequation of all things to divinity, to divine word, which is an exemplar of all. And things are true insofar as they participate in it. They are like it, because likeness in this context is a real cause. Something to be like something is a causal relation. It's very important. So when you compare these two, and when we go back to conclude with this post-truth, this is not something abstract, and I wouldn't go into some apocalyptic predicting and saying that truth of Christianity or truth of tradition, even of metaphysics, of truth of everything that was before late 17th century is coming back to the fore. But some things are really, because, and it couldn't happen 50 years ago, but now it does, because the notions that were understood as unquestionable in modernity are crumbling, and we see it in this violent revolutionary farce, that farces in plural that are going on, because you know that saying that history first is being enacted as tragedy and then as a farce. I think we are living in a farcical age, because most of those people, most of those neo-communists, for instance, are in fact role playing. They are not. Everything they do because they are allowed to do it. And what they're doing are, in fact, living in virtual worlds of their imagination, and they are being given an opportunity from virtuality to influence empirical physical reality and change it, which provides them illusion that they are changing the world at will. In some corners, for instance, in in some right-wing internet movements, they really believe that they, by their sole acts of imaginations, they change the world with memes and such. This is the illusion. This is very peculiar form of illusion that is possible only with the advent of virtual technologies and so on. But we talked about this elsewhere. We won't go into it. And in this situation, where you have this dissolution of the one concept of truth, one notion of truth, it kind of, by its very nature, brings you back to truth itself. Illusions, a post-truth could be understood as post-illusion also, because it is very hard to keep illusions these days. For instance, illusion in the belief in this humanistic ideal of human decency and that is coupled with progress in sciences. It is obviously a sham. Now it is obvious because it is powerless. It is powerless in the face of the forces it itself unleashed. As you see, when these destructive movements are taking hold, and however far left people are going, and maybe in the future they'll go far right, we don't know that. However far left they are going, they always go further and further, and they're destroying their heroes. From somebody was a saint a few days ago, now he's condemned, and so on and so forth. And every so often the new victim group is invented, and so on and so forth. This is just a symptom of this process of dissolution of the notion of truth that was based on faulty foundations. Hope you found this interesting and informative. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune signing out.